Welcome everyone to the second session of the day. Today we're here with Carol from IBM Watson, and I'll hand this over to her to introduce herself as well as what she'll be presenting today.
Great, thank you, Jerry. I'm Carol Smith. I work at IBM Watson. I lead a team of designers working on two different products. We work on Watson Discovery as well as Watson Knowledge Explorer, and those are tools that are used to both train the system as well as to create new applications with the system. So you can bring in your data, you can train the system to understand your data, and then you can share it with the world in whatever way you'd like to. And today I'm going to be talking about usability testing in Agile. I've been working in Agile for about half of my career. I've been doing user experience work for 16 years and working in Agile environments for 9 of those years. And so I'm going to share some of my experiences and best practices with bringing usability testing into that whole environment. I look forward to your questions as well. So here at IBM, we have IBM Design Thinking, and as part of that, we have different roles, and the 3 roles on my team are design researchers, user experience designers, and visual designers. And these individuals overlap quite a bit. So we have researchers who are doing interaction design and wireframing and prototyping, and then we have visual designers who are doing interaction design. It's not common as much to see the researchers and the visual designers switching, but they do that as well. But typically they tend to stay in their strength area and then work to support the other portions of the group. And you'll hear more about design thinking and Agile with Vera Rhodes tomorrow, here on the UXPin webinars. So our Watson squads are actually embedded. The UX designers are embedded in them. We have the researchers and interaction designers are actually on each squad. We use the Spotify, similar to a Spotify method anyway, if you're familiar with that. And the visual designers sometimes are shared, often are shared. Sometimes they are specifically assigned to a squad. It depends on the situation. And then the designers do consult on other teams as needed. So if a team just needs a reality check, then the designers will move to that team temporarily and then come back to their home squads. And we do very light design and lean UX as much as possible. So we're not creating pixel perfect comps. We are doing iterative, repeatable work, and it's incremental, and we're really just working on getting to 80% confidence and getting it out there as quickly as possible to support the development teams. We don't do big design up front. We do just enough, identify and solve those problems, and then use the studies to pick up more information as we go. We're not doing 6-month research studies. We're doing everything as quickly as we can. That doesn't mean we're not doing research. We're just doing it very quickly. We try to think ahead, not make ahead. So we might do concept cars. In fact, we do those frequently to set the vision so that we all have a shared North Star. But those are very rough. Some early ideas, maybe it looks a little wireframey, but it's not actually anything that would be implementable. Again, we're thinking ahead, not making ahead. So that should give you a little bit of an idea about IBM design thinking here at Watson. And then today I'm really going to be focusing on usability testing in Agile. So how do we fit that testing into the Agile process? When is it ready? Whatever is ready is what we're testing, and it's never too early. The best feedback is the early feedback, and how to do that regular testing. So if you're not familiar with usability testing, we're talking about testing with representative users, so people who are actually typical of the people you're targeting for the work. Ideally, they match with your personas if you're using personas. They're doing real tasks on the product or the prototype, and they're being observed. They're not being led, they're not being guided. They are using the product, and you are learning from their activity. And again, prototypes, live products, whatever it is that we're testing, that is what is that they're interacting with. This is not user testing. This is one of my my pet peeve points. Usability it's important to realize that there is a difference. When we refer to this as user testing, it infers that we're testing people, and that we're not trying to determine if the participant can figure out our design work. We're actually testing the product. We're testing the success of that product and its ability to meet their needs, its ability to allow the participant to perform well. And so by using the word usability testing and not user testing, we're putting that focus on what is actually being tested. a few true statements. These are courtesy of Steve Krug in his Rocket Surgery Made Easy book. All interfaces have usability problems. If you always have successful usability studies, you're doing something wrong. You should definitely be finding problems in every study. We all have limited resources to fix them. There's always going to have to be that prioritization effort, which is painful. There are more problems than there are resources. Those less serious problems, those little tiny defects are always going to distract you. Try to focus on those big problems. Make an intense focus on fixing the most serious problems first and try to ignore the little stuff. Don't sweat the small stuff. So I want to talk a little bit about how to actually get this work in the Agile system. There are different ways of looking at this. I really prefer the parallel track workflow or staggered sprints, depending on how you think about it. But the idea here is to be able to make space for thinking ahead and for doing this work. And this is something that Desiree Tsai wrote about in her article many years ago in the UXPA journal, JUICE, the Journal of Usability Studies. And she wrote about two different tracks, a developer track and what she called the interaction designer track, and I refer to as a UX track because it's more than just interaction design that can happen during that work. In the developer track, the focus is on production. So it's a whole team, including the UX team, designers, working directly with the developers, working to get the product out, to get a good quality working software out. Whereas the UX track is focused on the user contact, on getting feedback, on learning, on really trying some new things. And this work is done, again, at the same time. It's the same team. These aren't two separate teams. These aren't people with different goals, shared product. It's just that they're doing different work. So for example, if you do have an iteration 0, that might be where the user experience team is planning and gathering customer data, doing some initial work, while the development team is actually doing back-end work. Maybe they're setting up systems and that sort of thing. And then the work separates as you start to do early work for the next iteration, and the development team is doing work on the current work. And then as that in the bottom section here, you can see the design for iteration 2 is now going into implementation. So that work moves up into the other sprint. And so you end up in the cycle where the work is, any work that's completed can be tested. It can be brought into usability testing, and you can test that code that's actually already functional, and then new ideas are being brought into the development world so that you're feeding each other constantly, and there is the ability to get feedback on the work that's already done. So you'll see the testing here and here. The testing is consistent and constant, both on working code as well as the customer data and prototypes that you're working on. So you can test multiple things at once potentially. So I'm talking about two different types of work. This is something that Jeff Patton just wrote about very recently. You may have seen his article. There's development work where we're maximizing velocity to make that working software, and the discovery work where we're working to learn. We really want to understand those user problems, come up with some solutions, and see if they're actually the right solutions. And he uses this graphic to describe how the two are working together. And so you can see at the top, there are items that are being killed. Sometimes those ideas just aren't very good. They don't do well in usability testing, and that's okay. It's important to do that learning early and to solve the right problems and solve them the right way. And so that work is ongoing and is a little messy because it's iterative. Meanwhile, the development team, again, is consistently trying to ship software with the design team supporting that work. And this work in the bottom half must be the priority. The priority is always to make software. So sometimes the research is delayed a little bit when the development team needs more support, and that's okay. The important piece between all of this is that there's good communication so that everyone is aware of what is going on, so that the teams know what the feedback has been and that they know what the priorities are going forward, and that the work is not just being handed off, that people are working together, it's happening all at once, and that the work doesn't always move from discovery to development. As I said, that we're actually learning from this and not just throwing things over the wall to get it done. So the pros and cons of this, the pros are that space is made for discovery work, whereas if it has to be prioritized against the other work, it doesn't always get done. The cons are that it could potentially lead to that big design upfront work, which we don't want, and turn into more of a waterfall process. And so we have to avoid that, and it's something you have to be mindful of. And when you notice that you're falling into that pattern, take a look at the process and see what needs to change. And this is also not something that one person can do. Clearly, you need a team to be able to do this. Otherwise, you will end up only supporting the development work, which isn't a bad thing. It just means that there's not as much room for learning early and trying out new things. This is a balancing act. So in order to meet production needs, the engineers need the designers to be developing that work to support them. And it also means that we can't do research forever. This is not, again, like in grad school potentially where you spent weeks on a project. We don't have that luxury in the industry. We need to be making software quickly. And we also want to be striving for best practices and user experience. So really to understand our users, to have that time to create personas and mental models, and to do the story mapping and other activities that help to make a really strong product with a good vision. So we need to make our methods leaner, but also focus on those outcomes. And this is always a balancing act. For existing products and teams, if you're currently working on a team, you may be wondering, well, how am I ever going to fit this in? How am I going to have a sprint zero? We don't have sprint zero. That's okay. Go ahead and try to start small. So fit some discovery work in the next sprint. Continue to prioritize that development work, of course. And in some cases, you may need a design spike, similar to a dev spike, where you really focus on these activities for a period of time, for a sprint or a section of time, however you're splitting up your work, and then you go back and to having it be part of the regular system. So what are we going to test? We can really learn from whatever is ready. This could be concepts, brainstorming activities that you're doing, work in progress, as I mentioned, the actual code, prototypes. This is my favorite way to do it. You make these prototypes really to learn, to find out what works and what doesn't. These could be clickable or code. Websites, mobile apps, competing designs. You may do some A/B testing. You may even do comparative studies where you're looking at your competitors. And also, of course, to conduct user research at the same time. Often we combine interviews and usability studies. In fact, I did one earlier this morning where about half of the study was interviewing and understanding their current situation, how they currently were solving their problems, and then the other half was showing them a prototype and having them use it to complete some tasks. So should it be clickable or code? Clickable is my preference. It's easy and quick to create. It's easy to change. I don't necessarily have to wait until a developer is available. In many cases, some of my team actually are very capable coders themselves and can do that. But there's more time invested. There's more energy in it. It's great if it works out and it really is the right solution, but it's risky as well. I don't recommend paper for this type of testing because the participants may misunderstand how to use the paper. We do a lot of remote studies. In fact, the majority of our work is user remote studies. So we can't even easily do that with participants. The paper prototypes just don't work. So I highly recommend using clickable, not so much on the code unless you're very confident and very good at making those adjustments as needed. And when do you do it? Of course, early, as I already mentioned. And it can be really done anywhere, especially the remote studies. The remote studies, we really just need a quieter room to be able to run the study. We can use the unmoderated studies, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, and those can be done while we sleep. And the most important thing is realistic as far as the tasks and the test environment in general, that you're allowing them to do this work when it is as close as possible to a realistic situation so that you can get the best learning possible. So I want to talk about testing methods. What is it, when you think about which testing method you want to use, think about what you need to know. What's going to get you to the point where you're 80% confident in the work that you have, or that you are able to disprove with confidence whatever it is that is being shown or wants to be tested as a potential solution? What's the bare minimum of effort that you can put forth in order to get the best results? So we place higher value on repeatable formative studies. So we're not working on summative studies, if you're familiar with the difference between formative and summative. Formative is the prototypes, thinking about, what could this be, what should this be, really understanding at an early stage, whereas summative is when you're done with some work and you want to see about performance. We don't do summative testing for the most part. We really focus on formative studies that we can learn from and repeat over and over, not the same exact study, but as much as possible from that study. When you're thinking about what studies to do, you also want to think about your scope. So what are your resources? What kind of budget do you have? How much time are you really going to be able to devote to recruiting, facilitating, and analyzing the study? If you have many, many participants, it's going to make a much larger effort needed to be able to analyze that and actually bring some findings through. So a small scope is better. This study was done 17 years ago, my entire career, and it is still standing as being the standard. So 5 to 7 participants are really what you need to uncover the 80% of the usability problems. And typically with 3, a minimum of 3, you can get at least a tiebreaker. But if you can get 5 to 7 participants, that's ideal, because then you'll be able to see patterns, you'll be able to find the majority of issues. We don't worry about being statistically significant in this type of work. And more participants, as I already mentioned, you really get diminished returns. There's so much more work to do to be able to analyze that and to be able to effectively communicate your findings that it isn't worth the extra effort. And again, these are participants who are representative of a specific user group. So they match your personas, or they're very similar in their needs and the way that they need to use the system. However you're doing that grouping, and that they're doing representative tasks. And there's also an assumption that whatever you're using, the really big issues have been reviewed by, it's been reviewed by a UX person, so that it's not a horrible experience to begin with. You've taken care of some of the big issues as well. So you're not showing them something that's really, really rough. So with those testing options, these can be moderated, so in-person moderated or remote. So in person, you actually invite the person to your office, or you go to their offices, in their home, wherever it is. And remote being usually through a web meeting or some software that you're using, but you're actually communicating with the person with your voice, and potentially able to see them as well. With unmoderated, these are online tools, usertesting.com. There are many, many of these available right now. And this is where the participant is doing the study without a moderator at all involved. And these all should be quick, as I mentioned already. 3 or more participants, you at least need a tiebreaker, and short sessions. If it's moderated, 30 minutes to 1 hour, I try to never go above 1 hour. And then unmoderated, you want to keep those to about under 20 minutes, and sometimes they need to be even shorter depending on the software that you're using. And again, see, those are limited in the amount of work that you can have done, but you also can get quick results from this. The pros of moderated studies are getting to that why. You can ask follow-up questions. If someone does something you don't expect, you can ask questions about it. If they're not talking enough, you can ask them to think out loud. You can work with them a bit longer, as I mentioned, 30 minutes to 1 hour, and you can save the session if things are going off the rails, so to speak. If things aren't working well, you can do something about that, or you can just end the session if you feel that the individual is really not appropriate for your session. The cons are it's hard to recruit moderated. You need those times to be when you're available and when your team is available, so it's much harder to get that done, and it can take a lot longer to plan potentially. You'll need rooms and things like that. With unmoderated, the pros are that you get those quick answers, and they can complement a moderated study very nicely. So if you did a moderated study and you have some open questions, you can get those answered really quickly. The recruiting is very easy. Many times these systems will do it for you. Usertesting.com, as an example, will do that for you. You can also give them a list of individuals if you have them. The cons can be the recruiting. If they are doing it, it's very relaxed. So if you say you need a scientist, you may get a scientist, but they may not be the scientist that you actually meant. So you do have to be careful with that. And many of the participants are professional participants in that they do many, many studies during the week and potentially during a day. And so in some cases, they have gotten very used to looking at these types of interfaces and responding to them in somewhat of a rote fashion, which is good in some ways because they've seen so many interfaces. They know what good patterns are and what bad patterns are, at least for their experience. But it's also potentially negative in that they're not new and fresh to the whole process. The participants can use their camera or the internet only, depending on how you want to set it up. And here's another way to look at the comparisons between moderated and unmoderated, whether the researcher is present or not, how much effort it is. There is more effort with moderated studies. The number of participants per day. So you are limited, if nothing else, by your ability to speak to about 3 to 6 participants per day, whereas with unmoderated, you can do higher numbers of participants per day. And the feedback. The moderated is immediate, but it's over time, whereas unmoderated, usually it takes a couple days to compile it. It's not something where you can see the results necessarily immediately. And moderated, again, you can get to the why by asking additional questions, whereas you have a reduced or a no ability to actually get more information with unmoderated. The benefits in general for remote testing: you don't have to travel, neither does your participant. It's easy to set up. You can conduct these from almost anywhere, and the option is available to you to see the participant's actual environment. You can see their browser, you can see their desktop, you can see how they actually set things up and what browser views they're using, that sort of thing. The drawback, again, you're not seeing them in person, so you're missing some of that qualitative experience. You may miss some body language. You may miss inflections in their voice that you might pick up better if you saw them in person. So there are a lot of different things that you do miss with the remote studies, but they're an excellent way to get work done. For remote moderated sessions, there are some requirements. You do need a robust computer that can run the system while running your prototype or whatever it is that you're doing. You do need some sort of screen sharing software and fast internet for you as well as the participant. So they may not be able to participate if they're not able to do voice over IP, or if they don't have a separate phone line. So you do need to do a little vetting sometimes to make sure that they are set up to do everything in the way that you need them to. The participant's camera is, as I mentioned, optional, and people are becoming more comfortable with this. I don't actually include that as part of my remote studies. I feel like that's pretty invasive, and a lot of times people are in their home or they're at their office where they simply don't feel comfortable, or they're actually not allowed to use a camera. So it's an interesting point of contention right now in our field. If you want to know more about remote testing, I published an article in ACM Interactions, and you'll be able to get the link from this PowerPoint when it's shared. So for software tool considerations, you want to think about, are you going to be in person or are you going to be remote? And if you're in person, are you in your office, your typical environment, or are you going to be at a different location, maybe the participant's office? And you'll want to think about their access to the internet and your ability to use that. The prototype itself may have some limitations. You want to think about that. Are you able to put it online? Are you able to share it with someone without any issues? And your organization may have limitations as far as people being able to access your office or access the prototype. So you want to think about that ahead of time. How many participants are you going to need? How many observers do you expect? What are your requirements for logging the actual video and the video editing? Do you need time on task, for example? Do you need to time those closely? And what kind of highlight reel are you going to make? Hopefully you will make one. This is a really helpful way to share the information. But how much help are you expecting through the capturing tools? And also, do you need to include surveys before or after the study? And if so, does the software support that? And are you including things like eye tracking and other more complex tools, and does your tool support that as well? So here's a simple way to think about it. You can make a 4-square 2x2 on whatever your parameters are, if it's simple and complex, unmoderated and moderated, and think about the tools that you have access to and where they fall on this, and that can help you to select. So do some simple activities to help you get the best user experience for you and your team as well. Do you need a formal lab? Yeah, it's nice, but the question I always wonder is, are your users actually local? Do the majority of your users, or at least the people that you want participating in your studies, actually reside near enough by that they're going to come to your office? And if not, you can probably skip the formal lab. If you do get a formal lab, I do recommend just getting the large screen TVs and using cameras. You're going to want cameras anyway, and the two-way glass is very expensive. It takes a long time to install, and you can put a large screen TV on the wall very easily, and then wire it up to the cameras, and you've got a full system, or wireless actually works very well. I recommend obviously having a laptop to have a portable lab. If you can have one that's dedicated, that's great. But most of my team actually uses their own computers, and that works very well. We all have laptops, we all have the software installed on our computers, and we're ready to go when we need to be. We have very minimal setup. So make this work repeatable. I've talked about this quite a few times already. The idea is to have usability testing at such a regular cadence that people are excited about it. They're wanting to know when the next one is. They're preparing their work so that it can be tested in that study, and that it's really something that the whole team is getting excited about and it's driving the work. I mentioned Steve Krug's book already, Rocket Surgery Made Easy. This is a great guide. There's some really helpful stuff in the back. And he talks a lot, again, about prioritizing, making sure that you're really solving the important problems first. So as you're doing this work, again, you want to do small focus tests and keep your recruitment time to a minimum. Do them as much as possible. So ideally once per sprint. One of my projects right now, we're doing them every other sprint very regularly, and on the other project, we're doing them about every third sprint. Sometimes it's every other sprint, sometimes it's every third sprint. Ideally, it would be once per sprint. I would like us to get to that point. And if possible, do it at the same day, on the same day or days, midweek. You want to avoid Mondays and Fridays. It's just harder to schedule. People forget. It's a lot easier if you're doing it in the middle of the week. And again, this regular testing helps the team to get used to getting insights regularly, and they become more accepting of regular critique on the work that they're doing, and it also encourages the team to begin to get better at making quick decisions, so that as the business needs change, as the users' needs are adjusted and goals are adjusted, you can continue to make those changes as needed, and keep the progress moving, keep your cadence and your velocity moving. Design stories are important to actually be in your repo. So some of the stories that you might have include the problems that you'll find while usability testing. You don't know what those problems are necessarily, but you'll definitely want to make sure that there's space for that work to be done. So that even if you just plan that particular story with, maybe a medium level of effort, that at least provides a space for that work to get done. The biggest risk with usability testing is doing it at a point where nothing can change, and then it's a wasted effort. You want to make sure that there's not only room to do the study, but room to actually enact those changes and to make those improvements on the work. You may want a story about researching to inform personas and make sure that there's space and time for that work, as well as the design and UX debt that you'll accumulate as your product matures and as you make some changes that affect other pieces of the application. They may not be high priority, but they may be things that you want to address. And you'll want to make sure that there is someone on your team who is able to advocate to get this work prioritized. Someone who's involved in the planning meetings. It may be that you just have the person who is doing that planning work be aware of which stories are really important to your team, and maybe make them a list before those planning sessions if you can't be there in person, or ideally you're part of that team. And again, I already talked about this, but learn from whatever you have, whatever is ready, take that work and bring it into these sessions. So how do you manage all of this? Planning is tight. It's always going to be tight. Time is always going to be against us, unfortunately. So select what it is that you're going to test, create the guide as quickly as you can, again, reusing as much as possible, and determine what you need to recruit and automate if you can. The reusable templates that you could make include a screener. You might be able to use the screener multiple times, especially if you're using the same type of persona. The guides and scripts, potentially at least the intro material and some of the surveys and things like that could be reused. Consent forms can always be reused, and the way that you collect the data, potentially you could have a template for that. So it just saves you a little bit of time each time that you're doing these studies. If you pre-book your rooms quarterly, you'll also save a lot of time. This can be a painful experience. So if you already have a time when you're planning on doing the studies, go ahead and use the repeat calendar function and reserve those. I only recommend a quarter at a time, mostly because, at least with my system, those calendar items can sometimes become corrupt and cause all kinds of trouble, or you have 5 new people come in and 3 people move, and it's easier to just do 1 quarter at a time for those reasons. And again, any location, a conference room, an office, a quiet corner of the cafeteria, whatever you have available, use it. And you know, you can always just apologize for the noise if you have to, but hopefully you can find a quiet area. The actual recruiting, if possible, I always recommend hiring a recruiter, but watch how this affects your budget. If it's, you know, if they're very expensive recruiters, you're going to be able to do a lot less work. So you want to think about that. But if possible, use a recruiter. A good recruiter is going to help you find the right participants. They'll give you regular updates on the recruiting progress. They'll take care of directions, confirmations, incentives, whatever it is you need. They should do it all and allow you to focus on what you really need to be doing, which is improving the product and planning these studies properly. If you need to do it yourself, you can do it by email. This is primarily how I recruit right now. You can do it by phone. You can put posters up in the cafeteria or in a coffee shop, wherever it is. You can also use panels, using customer lists and that sort of thing to gather up people. Panels can be problematic if you end up repeating the same people over and over again. You have the risk that you're actually creating something for those few people instead of for your larger group of individuals across organizations. So you do want to be careful with that, but having a panel can be extremely helpful, especially if you are working on the same type of efforts over a long period of time. If you do have internal resources, it could even be an intern or someone who's new to the company who understands what you need. You could have them potentially do the recruiting or at least support your recruiting efforts. You can also use sites to recruit. This is an old version, but Ethnio is one of the sources that you can use to actually recruit in the website or the app that you have. You also probably have your own feedback types of forms, and you can include these types of recruiting efforts in those in many cases. So see what you can do within your actual product to get your users, the ones who are passionate, to participate in these types of studies. As always, include people with disabilities. We are all only temporarily able-bodied, and being able to use your product and be able to do what it needs to be done effectively is really important. So know the law, but build for the spirit of accessibility. Make sure that you're not just, you know, doing the bare minimum. If it's not an afterthought, it's not something you sprinkle on later. Someone tweeted that recently. It really needs to be an integral part of your application, and everyone deserves a really good experience with your product. If you're doing honorariums, keep it easy for yourself. If you're in person, just buy a pile of gift cards from the retail stores in your area and use those. That's the easiest way. If it's remote, you can use online gift cards. These can be a little tricky. If you're doing international studies, you may actually need to figure out a different option. In some cases, I've used online money transfer to give people the cash. Legally and financially, you may have more issues there depending on your organization. And if you have a more complex situation, you may need to give product credits or swag, although I had a recent experience where I was giving swag away, and at this point I would say don't bother. It's not only very complicated to help them determine which swag they want, it's very complicated to actually get it to them. It's really not worth it. And you can get a decent response without any honorariums or incentives. It's not as good, but you can get decent responses. When the day comes, make sure the team is aware, a few days before preferably. Invite everyone to attend and observe. They can watch remotely if they need to. And make sure it's a recurring meeting invite for stakeholders. Make sure that they know that they are always invited. We often have our product owners. I had a product owner and 2 product owners actually in the session this morning. We invite our developers. Anyone who is part of the team should be welcome to observe so that they can get an idea of what these users are like. We don't want to be the only ones holding this information. Everyone needs to be aware of the users. As far as observing, all of the stakeholders, the decision makers, and everyone else on the team should be an active observer. They should be taking notes. Ideally, if you have an in-person session, let them greet the participants. Let them get to know these people. These are humans, and they have needs and desires, and having them interact with these people is really important. Again, taking notes, create a template for them if that's helpful, and have them help you operate software, recording equipment, that sort of thing. Make sure that they're really feeling like they have a part of this and that they are an active, not only observer, but participant in the whole process. The pros of observers is, of course, that they gain empathy for these users, that they understand the struggles and what works for the users, and that they can make quick decisions with real information. The cons, of course, is that we are all limited by time, and getting them to attend this instead of a different meeting can be very difficult. And not all the sessions are great. We, regularly have a participant who won't speak out loud or doesn't really understand what they're even supposed to do, and didn't turn out to be the right individual to begin with. But most of the sessions are really good, and I almost always learn something from the session. So if you can get them there, that's great. For note-taking, keep it as simple as possible. A big paper whiteboard, or literally a whiteboard, or a poster paper that you can put on the wall is perfect for just tagging, individual activities. So did this person use a particular widget? What were they confused about? That sort of thing. If you want to type, make sure that you ask the participant if they're bothered by it. Most people will not be, but it's good to ask. Also consider, if you're on the computer, are you actually going to be able to pay attention? Are you going to be distracted by too many other things? You can shut down most everything, as I'm sure many of you do when you're presenting, but make sure that really you are going to be present while you're taking notes on the computer. For example, in my team, we don't allow anyone to hold or have a cell phone when they're conducting a usability test. That has to be off to the side for that period of time. It's just too much of a distraction. It's too easy to get sidetracked. And your job at that point is to focus on the participant and to make sure that they're having a good experience, and that they are feeling involved and engaged in the work that you're doing with them. So for analyzing, debriefing, and making those recommendations, the debrief with the team should occur before any analysis has been done. Ideally, the stakeholders have been involved in the usability studies, they've been watching them and observing them, and they are ready to make quick analysis and make some decisions. But if not, you'll need to do a quick analysis so that decisions can be made. But ideally, you can do a full debrief with the team. For the debrief, the decision makers need to be present. As I said, they have been watching these studies already, and they know what's going on. You have to stay on topic and be constructive, and don't let people get distracted by small problems. So if there is a font oddity or something with people didn't like the color or something, don't let that distract you. Make sure you have an intense focus on fixing the most serious problems first. The goal in these sessions, and again, this is from Steve Krug's book, identify the top 5 or 10 most serious issues. The top 3 from each observer's list, ideally they come with a list of the 3 things that they observe that they feel are really, really important, and then you can prioritize from those lists. Commit resources for the next sprint, and you're done. You stop at that point. You don't continue to list out the millions of things that you could do. There will always be more work as long as there is a product, so you don't need to worry about listing ad nausea, hundreds of things. Just get enough for the next work. You can always go back and pull from that if you need to, and you'll probably catch it in the next study as well. Find your love for Excel. Cal Saucy did a presentation at the IA Summit this past March, and she talked a lot about how Excel is really powerful. If you love Excel, be good with that. Excel's a wonderful tool. You're looking for patterns in the data. Whatever tool you need to use to find those patterns is great. Read between the lines. Look for what you got. Go with your gut. You know basically what happened in these studies. Go with that. You know what's important. But also look for what potentially refutes your expectations. So you had expectations going into the study. We all do. Write those down before the study, and then make sure that you pay special attention to that you are not simply going with something because it's easy, and that the evidence is actually there for what you're thinking. What were the surprises? What were outliers? Look at all the data at the big high level as well as at the deeper level. Don't be a tree killer, please. No one is going to read a large report. No one is going to do anything with that but put it on a shelf. If they really want something to put on their shelf, you can give them an empty binder and put your company name in the and the end point and leave it at that. Big reports really aren't doing anyone any favors, and it's really bad for the environment. So just do enough. Do a bulleted list. Who's going to use this information and how? Make sure you think about that as you're creating that list, and then share it via common tools. So you can send it in an email, you can put it in a wiki, in the box file, whatever it is that you use as a team, put it there. And keep it short. Include the goals of the study and those high-level findings and recommendations, and that's really it. Just link to the guide and the analysis and the other information. There's no reason to actually put that into a report format. If anyone has deeper questions, you can always have a conversation about it. But there is no sense in spending days creating a report that will not be read by anyone. Make sure that you also tie what you found into the repo, into the actual story. So find those stories that are related to what you have learned and put that learning in the comments on those stories within the repo. So if you're using GitHub or any of the other tools, make sure that you find those stories themselves and then add that into it. If it's tangential, so for example, you were studying XYZ area of the app and someone mentioned that there were issues with this other thing, make sure you mention that that's not really what you were focused on in this study, that it was tangential, but it's still interesting and of note. And then again, put it into the comments so that it's recorded in the right place, so that when people are doing the work to make that story happen, they have all the information they need. Tweak your work, don't redesign. So make small iterative changes, make something better now, don't break something else. But at the same time, remove what you can. Reduce the distractions. Don't just add something to add something, especially not features. People don't typically need new features unless they have expressed a need. So question when things like this come up. And again, this is from Steve Krug's book. So faster usability testing fit the testing into the usability process, fit usability testing into the Agile process. Make it work with the team. Make sure the team is involved. It's never too early. Make sure that you're testing things that are helpful to you now, and whatever is ready, go ahead and test it. And do this regularly. Do this testing as regularly as possible, as frequently as possible, and make sure that the whole team is bought into the process. If you need to contact me, here's some contact information, and I think we have plenty of time for questions.
Yeah, great job, Carol. We certainly do. And before we get into questions, I've been mentioning this in all of the sessions, but we have a Slack channel, and if you have more than 3 years of experience, we do encourage you to apply to Product Tribes. Got about 4,000 folks there right now. There's a lot of great conversations around design, engineering, and product management. And with that being said, let's dive into some of the questions now. We have quite a few. And so we had a few questions really around planning, and that is, when sprints are 2 weeks long, how do you usually fit user feedback and user testing within that 2-week period? Would be great to hear how you guys approach that at IBM.
Yeah, so typically we would be creating a prototype, for example, during part of the sprint. It depends how big the work is that we need to do. In some cases, we would need the entire sprint to create a prototype, and then we would use that next sprint to actually test it. So it depends. In some cases, we while we're doing that prototype, we're actually doing the recruiting as well. And then at the end of that sprint, we're ready to go. And the first week of the next sprint, we're doing the testing. And by the end of the second week in that 2-week sprint, we are done with that testing and have made our recommendations and already wrapped up everything. So it depends. If you have shorter sprints, we tend to use 2-week sprints as well. It can be more difficult to do it in every sprint, but that is the gold standard. It also depends on team size. We have a relatively small team on the team that I'm conducting the usability tests on. There are only 3 of us, so I'm the researcher. There's a visual designer and an interaction designer, so we're pretty tight. And the visual designer is typically supporting dev consistently, and then the other 2 of us are helping her as needed. And then I'm doing all the research work, and then the interaction designer is supporting really both of us as well. So it's tight with the other team in my group. They have a larger team, and so that they're able to do a little bit more and a little bit faster because they have more people. So it depends on the situation.
Right, right. And the next question is about presenting findings. So since user testing in an agile process isn't always statistically significant, what have you found to be the best way to present your findings to stakeholders who love numbers, right? They're very quantitatively driven. How do you communicate the value of this qualitative insight?
Right, and it can be difficult. There is the problem of you can lead the horse to water, but you cannot make it drink. And I certainly, try as best you can. If they don't see the value, you may need to go to forums and other places where people are submitting information, and you might be able to find patterns there that are more substantial, that actually support your work with numbers. It's a tough argument. Usually the best thing I can recommend is having those stakeholders sit in a usability study. If they're not able to sit in the usability study, make a highlight reel, a highlight video with some of the situations where your users are struggling, and let them be aware of the quotes, the things that they're saying, how they're interacting with it, and they should see value in that. It can be tough though, and sometimes it's not going to work for those individuals.
Right, and we also had a couple of questions around this challenge, which is in the testing process. Do you always find new users to test, or what is the blend of current users, new users, and even past test participants that you sort of use throughout each iteration of the design? It would be great to get an idea of just what that looks like.
Yeah. So we typically try to get a mix of, so I should say our products are fairly new. So one of the products is a year old and the other one's about 6 months old. So almost everyone's new or newer to the products. So we do have that situation. In general, even the most experienced people have only been using it for a year, and we're constantly making changes to it. So it's kind of a new situation every time. As far as reusing participants, we do try to break it up so that we're not talking to the same people for every study. So for example, in the study I did this morning, we had a very, very helpful participant. He was really a great participant as far as participants go, gave great feedback, had a lot to share, and then actually offered to be a participant again in a study, which doesn't happen very often. Usually you have to ask. And so I will be keeping his name. I told him I'd probably contact him in September and October, which is a little tighter than I prefer. I would prefer to have it every 6 months, but we actually have a shortage of participants. So I'm eager to be able to reuse him, but I do want to wait a while. We try to space those out reasonably, again, so that we're not designing for one particular individual, and so that we're not in a situation where we end up feeling beholden to a particular customer. One of the Agile principles is to really partner with customers and do like that user acceptance testing and things like that. And that's really exactly the opposite of what we want to do with the work that we're doing. We're building things for many customers, not just one. And so we want to make sure that we don't fall into that trap of, well, Joe really liked it. Joe's just one user. We need to make sure that we're really building for that broader set.
Right. And as a follow-up question, do you find that your team tests with the same user throughout multiple iterations, or for instance, in a project, iteration 1 is test with user group 1, iteration 2 is test with user group 2?
I have done that in the past. So I've done studies where we actually wanted to get the same user again to look at a new iteration. I haven't done that for many years, but I have done that in the past, and it can be very effective, particularly if you're building for a relatively narrow group of users, so people in a very specific industry, or actually a small department. In some cases, I've done internal work where we were building a tool for a small group of people, and so then we had no choice. They were our users, so we needed to do that with those individuals as well.
Right. And we had a couple questions here around usability testing tools. People were curious, what are some tools that you have found really useful for usability testing, just in general?
Yeah, Yeah, so I mentioned usertesting.com. We've been using it quite a bit lately, and that works really well for those unmoderated remote studies. And then we really just use screen sharing. So we use Zoom, we use IBM Smart Cloud, which is a screen sharing capability. In the past, I've used GoToMeeting and a variety of other tools. But really, we just use those screen sharing tools right now. We haven't been using any of the other tools as of lately anyway.
Got it. And someone was also wondering, you mentioned this concept of design stories. What are design stories? Are they the same as user stories?
I would make a comparison more with a back-end development story. So in some cases, you'll have a situation where the team needs to do an update to some sort of back-end software. There's no real benefit to the user. So you're not going to say, as a user, I need you to upgrade your whatever it is. That's more of a development or a back-end story. And the design stories are also not really benefiting the user in that the user needs you to take all their feedback and implement it. You could say that, but really this is a story that's going to help the user. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't take that placeholder and replace it with a real user story. That's very likely and recommended, of course. But that as a placeholder is really for the team, for the software. It's really to help build the software.
Right. And the next question we have is, I think it's going back to workflow here. Give me a second. This is actually very relevant and interesting. So you mentioned the idea of creating highlight reels of the studies. Is there any specific length that you try to adhere to for a highlight reel? And as a second question, would you have any particular advice for making that reel as impactful for stakeholders as possible?
Yeah, so I'd say short is best. So think about YouTube videos. How long are you willing to watch a YouTube video? Keep it that short. So 2 minutes, maybe up to 5 minutes, but really 2 minutes is ideal. So you really want to pack what you need to into that and make it just that interesting piece. So we've made them as long as, I think we made one that was 7 minutes once because there were longer interactions that were happening, and so it took a little bit longer to tell that story of what that individual was actually doing. But that's really long, and that wasn't one individual for 7 minutes. That was many individuals spliced together into that 7 minute time period. But again, as short as possible and really get to the point. So if you need to create a title slide that explains what they're about to do, and then show them doing it and struggling with it, or succeeding. It's always ideal to include some successes as well to keep morale high. But yeah, short, to the point. Don't, for example, cut out the part where you're asking them to do something. Cut out all of that and just get to the point. If you're not familiar with high quality video editing best practices, I would definitely Google that and find a YouTube video on video editing and follow those best practices.
Right. The next question here is more about scoping each user test. So someone is curious, is it better to test one user goal per test? So for instance, not testing a payment flow as well as contacting customer service or multiple flows in one test. How do you approach getting that right scope for one particular usability test?
It depends. If it's moderated, I actually do have transitions between my studies where the first part may be about the customer service experience, and then the second part might be about something else, and I just transition them into that. Now, that means that as a UX professional, I have multiple goals for my study. So I have goal A and study A that go together, and then it's like 2 different tests, goal B and study B, that go together. But you can definitely do that, but you do need to keep in mind for the user how that transition is going to occur so it's smooth, and it may or may not always follow the way you will analyze it either, and so that's something important to think about.
Right. Someone also had a question around fidelity of what you're testing. So in this person's process, it's pretty fast-paced. They may only be able to fit in one usability test.
Mhm.
Would you say that in that scenario, that medium fidelity might be the best choice if you're really scrunched on time and you have to, you can only run one
Yeah.
usability test?
I'd say it depends. I would say I would try to do that study as early as possible and go with the lowest fidelity possible so that you can make it better. It depends how you're getting to medium fidelity as well. If you're getting to medium fidelity through a really good critique with multiple people taking a look at it, maybe you're doing some guerrilla testing in the hallways, that sort of thing, then the medium fidelity may be great to test with because it's very solid. If you're getting to medium fidelity and you're working by yourself, I would be a little bit more hesitant to wait that long before getting feedback because it's potentially going to be problematic, and you'll incur more work to get it, to fix it, to make it for the next bit. The other thing I recommend is doing RITE testing. I didn't talk about that today, but it's rapid iterative testing and evaluation. And if you Google that, you should be able to find some presentations on it. And that is where you would test potentially, like on a Tuesday, you test with 3 users, you iterate on a Wednesday, and then you test with 3 more users on Thursday. And that way you get the best of quick testing and able to iterate and get some more feedback very quickly. And that's an excellent way to be able to fit more into less time.
Right, right. And then the next question that we have is, this is a broader question, really around Agile and getting the process embedded. So someone here is wondering, have you been in a situation either at IBM or even in your past work experience where you had to convince developers to get designers involved in the Agile process? And
Yes.
if so, how did you get their buy-in on the value of design um, and actually get design involved, especially when developers generally don't even know what their backlog is going to be until it's it's near iteration planning.
Right. So it depends on the situation. If it's truly a lack of ignorance, I often will just offer to help at first and say, we could give you some feedback on this. Is there something I can help you with? Is there a way that we could work together on this? I have some ideas. It depends on the team. It depends on the personalities. But ideally, I try to come in as a support person and offer ways I could help them. Often, a developer typically wants to be able to solve a programmatic problem. They don't necessarily want to solve a design problem. They typically would like to be able to use their skills to do something really cool with the technology. And so if I can lift off some of that responsibility and help them with the UI, that's often something that they really appreciate. And again, it depends on the situation. So look for ways to partner with them and support them and show them that you're in this with them and you're not competing with them. You really want to make the best product possible. And the other thing is to do brown bags and things like that to let them know the type of skills that you have and share as much as you can about the type of things that you can help them with and how you can complement each other and really help to make an even more successful product.
Right, right. And as a follow-up question here, um, somebody was also saying, how do you work with engineering teams who may insist that a release should just go out quickly and they can get user feedback afterwards and then address that in the next release? How do you convince them that user testing is actually necessary before the release, and then work with them to get that into the scope, especially since agile processes usually have pretty tight schedules?
Right, right. And it depends. Sometimes you do let that go, and you got to pick your battles. Sometimes it is not necessarily the best thing to argue that, and instead do that more of summative testing where your testing what has already been released and get that feedback, and then show that highlight reel. Sometimes that's very helpful. And in other cases, you can just talk about the idea of lean and failing early and really trying to learn as much as possible as early as possible versus getting something that is not ready out. But I'm also in favor of learning out in the field. So again, it depends on the situation. That's the often used answer in UX. But as much as possible, try to help them see that the benefit in making the right solution to making the right thing first is much better than potentially making something that's really not solving the problem and getting it out there and then having to try to fix it later. It's a lot better to fix it the first time than to fix it later, but without delaying to the point where you're not able to get software out.
Right. And so as a follow-up to that, I guess, would be, can you think of a situation in which, in your past work experience, in which it was acceptable just to get something out in the field first and then sort of learn from users as it was live instead of doing that testing beforehand?
Yeah, so in some cases, I have worked with teams where we've done a little bit of usability testing. The results were not really clear, and so things went ahead out to see what the feedback would be. In other cases, the team was already getting things out the door, and when by the time I got into the team, it was, things were already gone. And so that's another situation where that happens, and that's fine. Again, it's never too late usually to learn. It's just a question of how do we now take what we've got and move it to what we need. I mean, again, with any living product, it's always going to be changing and adjusting as it survives. When you think about Facebook or Twitter or any of the other tools out there, they change constantly, and that's the sign of a successful product, is being out there, learning from that experience, and then adjusting to the experience. So it's more a question of how are we going to manage that change than anything else.
Right. And have you found that testing the same user group continuously, whether throughout one, project lifecycle or revisiting them later on, can introduce some bias in the process?
It definitely can. It can also provide a nice sort of historical story, story about how things have changed and potentially the improvements, or maybe some things that you've done that have hurt their experience. So there's a lot of good with that, but it does have to be taken with a grain of salt, in that you don't want to create a situation where you are in that closed feedback loop with a very small set of users. So I think it can be very helpful as long as it's put in context.
Gotcha. We had a few questions here around timing and planning. So a couple people were curious if you could give an example of, let's say within a 2-week sprint, how much time generally might you spend on user testing and user research? They're just trying to get an idea of roughly the proportion of time within like a 2-week window.
Yeah, so mine is a weird situation because I'm also a manager, so I don't spend nearly enough, not the amount of time I should spend anyway. But I do have 2 other researchers on my team. One of them is also a part-time manager and part-time doing the research, and then another individual is a full-time researcher. So she's really spending the majority of her time either planning, recruiting, or running usability studies and research, as well as supporting the interaction design and doing critiques and working with development team and that sort of thing. So it depends on the situation, but our products are pretty complex and there's plenty of work to do. So we do a lot of different activities, and we're also, I mentioned at the beginning, we do concept cars and visioning work, and often the researchers are working on that as well. So there are a lot of different types of activities that the people can do, but it certainly can be easily a full-time job, if not multiple people's full-time jobs.
Interesting. So it sounds like on your teams, then it's the research truly is an ongoing process, and it's not just like, oh, within a 2-week sprint, day 1 and day 7 are for research. It's somebody is always doing research throughout that 2-week cycle.
Ideally, yes. Yeah, we've got enough activities going on, and there's enough there that they could be. It may not be research every day because they're doing other activities, but there's something going on consistently. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And the next question here, and we'll take 2 more questions because we're coming up on the end of the hour. Let's take a look here. Oh, I actually realized I forgot to launch a poll here, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. But yeah, meanwhile, let's see. So for the remote studies that you conduct, do you find that they are typically moderated or unmoderated? Do you lean towards one direction?
Yeah, by the numbers, it's probably about half, because we usually get more unmoderated studies done than moderated studies, but we do the majority of studies, I would say overall, are expected to be moderated. So and part of that's for preference reasons, and part of that is because it's harder to recruit for some of the products that we work on, and so we don't. In some cases, we are trying to solve a general interaction design problem, which anyone off the street probably can help us with. We really just need to determine what's the best way for someone to do XYZ. And in other cases, it's I'm training Watson, and I need to be, I need to be somebody who actually would do this work. And so for those, we definitely need them to be moderated to help those individuals. And the other reason to moderate is to really understand their situation and to have the best possible study as far as really getting to the why.
Right, right. And the last question that we'll take here actually is really about setting expectations. So somebody is curious, during, let's say, sprint planning or before you guys actually dive into the work, how do you inform stakeholders of what they can expect to get from the research? Is there, is there some sort of formal like outline of here's exactly what you as stakeholders will learn by the end of this, or yeah, so I'm just curious, what does that process of setting expectations for user research look like?
Yeah, so as part of the plan, we do set goals for each study, and we were talking about goals earlier, and so those goals are shared with the entire team, and we talk about them and we change them if people are feeling like they might be a little off. So that is part of the group work. We have working sessions at least once a week with the development team where we're specifically focused, having the developers come in on the UX work and give their feedback on the work that we're doing. So we're usually going to them to support their work, but at least once a week for an hour, they're coming to us to support our work and to give us critique and to review usability test plans, to review findings, that sort of thing. Plus, we're putting it in places where they can access it as well and tying it to those stories. So we really try to communicate as much as possible about that and to take their feedback into account and also test something they're working on. Sometimes they've got an idea that they want to get feedback on, and we encourage them to put in a clickable prototype, or if they want to put in code or whatever it is, and we'll test that too and give feedback on that. Some of the best ideas come from the development team.
Right, right. And on that note, I think we can close out the session here. Carol, thank you so much. That was a great job. A lot of great advice there. A lot of positive feedback from people here.
Great, so, my pleasure. Thank you.
I really appreciate the time here. And then thank you to all the people who joined us today. I think we had up to 800 people at one point.
Nice.
A lot of great questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to all of them. But of course, the conversation continues on product tribes. And Carol, I'll make sure to invite you after the session.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'll be there. Great.
Yep. And then as a final note, so our lunchtime session today is going to be a pure UXPin demo. And Lindsay from our customer team is going to be leading that. And she's going to be talking about how UXPin can help with developer collaboration and developer handoffs into implementation. So if you guys are at all interested in checking out UXPin, you can join that. It's a 30-minute, just pure informative product demo session that will be starting in about 2 or 3 minutes here. So feel free to join in on that. And then we have one afternoon session with Josh Seiden, who co-wrote Lean UX, and that will wrap up the day. But yeah, Carol, great job. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you all. Take care.
Yep. All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye.